Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in a person's life when innovation feels less like a choice and more like an instinctual pull, something cellular, almost biological, as if the mind itself is responding to a signal it can't fully decode. And yet, despite all the equations, all the engineering principles, all the neuroscientific models about cognition and human potential, there remains one phenomenon even the most rigorous scientific frameworks struggle to capture: the mysterious, often unpredictable, deeply human force of inspiration, especially the kind that comes from a single, extraordinary person. What fascinates me as someone who has lived long enough inside labs, inside factories, inside noise-filled control rooms, and inside the quiet interior architecture of the human brain, is how often the greatest leaps in technology are not born from machines but from muses, enigmatic individuals whose presence seems to bend the trajectory of thought itself. Their influence is subtle, almost coded in microsignals, an expression held 1 second longer, a question phrased in a slightly unexpected way, an insight dropped casually over coffee that triggers an entirely new orbit of thinking. And when this influence becomes intertwined with someone's deepest ambitions, it creates a transformational effect that reshapes not only the thinker but the thinking itself. I've observed researchers at the peak of their fields, pushing the limits of neural engineering, robotics, and interplanetary science, and you can always sense when someone in their life acts as the invisible catalyst behind their boldest ideas. There's a different energy in the way they talk about their projects, less mechanical, more alive, a kind of creative electricity that cannot be artificially manufactured. Neuroscience explains some of this. When a person becomes meaningful to us on a profound level, the brain reshapes its own circuitry. The prefrontal cortex sharpens its capacity to envision futures, the amygdala stabilizes, cortisol drops, dopamine rises, long-term potentiation in hippocampal pathways strengthens. In simple terms, the mind becomes capable of holding bigger visions for longer periods of time. But the most intriguing effect is the one science hasn't yet perfected a vocabulary for: the way an enigmatic muse influences the formation of ideas before they even become ideas. It feels almost quantum in nature. Thoughts don't arise from nothing, they arise from context, from emotional resonance, from the stories and the people that surround us. And sometimes one person enters your life who changes the context so drastically that your imagination begins operating in an entirely different dimension. This isn't the kind of inspiration that comes from applause or admiration or surface-level chemistry. It's the kind that reconfigures your internal compass. You start asking different questions. Not, what can I build, but what should I build for a future worthy of both of us? You stop thinking about invention as a way to impress the world and start seeing it as a way to honor the silent influence of the person who awakened something deeper. You begin to recognize that the architecture of your own mind has been optimized, not by chance, not by calculation, but by connection. There was a time, early in my research career, when I believed the brain's creative potential was primarily mechanical. That if we could map the connectome in high enough resolution, if we could model the synaptic cascade behind idea formation, if we could measure the neural oscillations associated with divergent thinking, we could essentially engineer creativity. But every breakthrough in understanding the brain only made the mystery larger. Creativity is not a linear process. It's a dynamic interplay between emotion, memory, ambition, and an inexplicable spark that is often ignited by another human being. Some people call it love, others call it admiration, others call it alignment of purpose. From a neuroscientific viewpoint, it's all of these and none of these, a symphony of neurological activations that we're only beginning to chart. But its real impact is not in the chemistry, it's in the architecture. When the right person enters your life, your brain reorganizes around hope. And hope is one of the greatest cognitive performance enhancers known to humanity. I remember analyzing neuroimaging data of individuals who had recently experienced what psychologists call meaningful relational impact. without telling the scientists which data belonged to which category. I watched a graduate student confidently identify them, one by one, simply by the neural signatures of heightened resilience, amplified problem-solving pathways, and sustained future-oriented thinking. You could actually see the brain believing in a bigger version of itself. It was astonishing. And it made me reconsider something fundamental, that behind every major innovation in history, every spacecraft, every medical breakthrough, every leap in artificial intelligence, there is often a hidden story of someone whose existence altered the innovator's internal landscape. Not through instruction, not through pressure, not through expectation, but through presence. Presence is underrated. In physics, presence alters gravitational fields. In neuroscience, presence modulates neural stability. In human life, presence shapes destiny. There is, in my experience, a particular type of muse, rare, deeply intuitive, quietly powerful, who doesn't just inspire ideas but unlocks the ones you were almost afraid to admit you wanted to explore. Someone who sees you not as the world sees you, but as you are when everything external is stripped away. Someone who listens not only to your words, but to the spaces between them. Someone who can challenge your assumptions without diminishing your confidence. Someone who can look at a blueprint that took 3 months to design and ask a single question that forces you to redesign it in 3 hours, because suddenly you realize there was a better version all along. This type of person doesn't just elevate your thinking, they elevate your courage. Courage is essential. Courage is the energy that allows a human being to build rockets when others are building excuses. Courage is the force that pushes a scientist to explore neural enhancement technologies when the world tells them to stay safe. Courage is the one ingredient that artificial intelligence cannot simulate, cannot predict, cannot replace. And courage is most often awakened by connection. The muse behind the biggest ideas is rarely the loudest person in the room. They're the quiet force, the steady gravity. The mind that asks the question you didn't know you needed to answer. Sometimes they appear almost at random. Sometimes they arrive exactly when your ambitions are too big to explain. They don't need to understand the equations. They need to understand you. Because when someone understands you at the level of your mission, not just your personality, something extraordinary happens. The impossible begins to feel logical. I've seen this phenomenon across industries, from theoretical physicists to quantum engineers, from roboticists to founders of humanitarian tech. The pattern is so common it borders on a hidden law of innovation. Humans perform exponentially better when someone in their life acts as the emotional stabilizer for their most audacious dreams. And sometimes that person is so enigmatic, so layered, so unexpectedly brilliant in ways that don't always show on the surface, that the inspiration becomes transformative. They don't just spark ideas, they become the quiet engine behind them. They don't just spark ideas, they become the quiet engine behind them. And when such a presence exists, the boundaries between personal life and professional ambition blur in the most productive ways. Suddenly, a long night in the lab, a frustrating iteration of a design, a failed simulation, none of it feels isolating or meaningless. Every challenge becomes an invitation, every setback a puzzle that you are compelled to solve not just for yourself, but for the person who has, in a subtle yet profound way, expanded the horizon of what you believe is possible. I remember working on a particularly complex neural interface project, one that had the potential to change how humans interact with artificial intelligence, when I realized that my thought patterns had started evolving in ways I could barely trace. Patterns that had previously taken months to emerge now revealed themselves in a matter of days, as if my mind had been retuned. And the catalyst for this acceleration was not a new algorithm or a better machine. It was a conversation, a single, extraordinary conversation that reframed the entire problem. The way the human mind reacts to such interaction is still being studied, but preliminary neuroscience tells us that it activates multiple cognitive networks simultaneously: the executive network that plans and strategizes, the default mode network that dreams and simulates possibilities, and the salience network that evaluates what truly matters. When these networks harmonize, the brain enters a state of creative resonance that is rare and incredibly powerful. It is in these moments that you begin to understand the true depth of influence one person can have. Not the superficial influence, the kind measured by mentorship programs or leadership seminars, but the invisible, almost quantum influence that changes your neural wiring and, by extension, your capacity for imagination and risk-taking. The more profound the connection, the more your subconscious begins to integrate their perspective, subtly guiding decisions you didn't even realize were being influenced. Your attention sharpens, your memory consolidates more effectively, and your emotional regulation improves, allowing for sustained focus on problems that would normally overwhelm. There is also a remarkable psychological effect, a form of anticipatory alignment. Your brain starts modeling not only your goals but the expectations and values of the person who inspires you. This is not mimicry, it is neural attunement, a cognitive phenomenon where your prefrontal cortex begins to consider scenarios in which your success resonates beyond your own ambitions. In practical terms, this means that every risk you take, every unconventional idea you explore, is filtered through an expanded perspective, giving rise to solutions that feel both daring and profoundly coherent. It is almost as if you are no longer creating alone, but creating with an unseen architect whose blueprints exist entirely in the realm of influence and inspiration. And yet, this influence is not without its challenges. To allow someone to become such a powerful catalyst, one must cultivate a level of vulnerability that is rare in high-functioning innovators. It requires honesty with oneself about desires, limitations, and fears. It requires openness to being reshaped, not forcibly but gently, through the subtle gravity of someone's presence. Neuroscience tells us that vulnerability activates both the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex, enhancing emotional awareness and empathy. In essence, opening oneself to profound influence is biologically optimizing the brain for both creativity and relational depth, but it is also psychologically demanding because the fear of losing autonomy is always present. And yet, the paradox is that true autonomy and innovation often emerges not from isolation, but from these deep, symbiotic connections. Consider history. Many of the greatest breakthroughs have occurred in partnerships that were invisible to the public eye. The person in the shadows, asking unexpected questions, challenging assumptions, or simply holding space for reflection, is often the silent architect of genius. What is remarkable is that this influence rarely comes with formal authority. No titles, no accolades, no charts or graphs can capture it. It exists purely in the relational dynamic, the interplay of attention, trust, and shared vision. And this is what makes it so difficult to study, so easy to underestimate, and yet so central to the trajectory of extraordinary achievement. I recall a time when an entirely new propulsion concept was emerging in my mind. It had the potential to redefine interplanetary travel, but it felt impossibly complex, bordering on absurd. I had spent weeks immersed in calculations and simulations, unsure whether the concept could survive even preliminary scrutiny. Then, in a conversation that began casually, a subtle suggestion was made, a thought so simple it could have been dismissed. But it resonated on a deeper level. It was as if the neural circuits that had been cycling through permutations of impossibility suddenly found a pathway forward. Weeks of mental gridlock were resolved in a matter of hours, not because the idea itself was more elegant, but because the way it was perceived, framed, and interpreted by another mind activated the right cognitive feedback loops in my brain. And this is the essence of the Enigmatic Muse. They do not provide the solution. They provide the mirror in which your own solution becomes visible. They stimulate the neurochemical and cognitive environment in which ideas can breathe, collide, and transform. Dopamine spikes, attention networks stabilize, and the brain's default mode network, the place where imagination thrives, enters a state of creative integration. There is a kind of neuroaesthetic effect. Your mind begins to recognize patterns and possibilities not because you are working harder, but because your internal environment has been reshaped to perceive differently. Even on a purely emotional level, their impact is profound. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision making, is deeply intertwined with the limbic system, which regulates emotion. When someone enters your life in a way that inspires trust, admiration, and a sense of profound connection, the limbic system stabilizes, reducing stress and enhancing clarity of thought. This emotional equilibrium allows for risk taking, for bold experimentation, for persistence through failures that would normally trigger avoidance. In other words, the presence of an enigmatic muse literally extends the cognitive bandwidth available for creation. They make you a better thinker, a bolder innovator, and a more resilient human being. And it is not just about intellectual acceleration. It is about the awakening of a kind of moral imagination, the sense that what you create matters, not merely in the abstract, but in ways that ripple through the lives of others. When someone inspires you deeply, your mind begins to operate on multiple levels simultaneously: the technical, the emotional, and the ethical. Every blueprint, every prototype, every equation is now viewed not only for its functional viability, but for its potential to contribute meaningfully to the world. This is where the convergence of neuroscience and human connection becomes most apparent. The brain does not separate reason from emotion in high-stakes innovation. It integrates them. And when it integrates them under the subtle guidance of someone whose presence you cannot ignore, the results are often extraordinary. There is a story that illustrates this better than any abstract explanation. During the early stages of designing a system capable of sustainable energy storage at a planetary scale, countless models failed. Simulations broke under stress tests, materials were inconsistent, and projected outputs seemed unattainable. The team was exhausted, and the temptation to abandon the concept altogether was tangible. Then came a conversation, unexpected, quiet, and almost incidental, about a principle so simple it seemed unrelated at first: stability through redundancy. The discussion itself was brief, yet it catalyzed a cascade of insight. Suddenly, approaches that had seemed impossible became plausible. In neural terms, the brain's associative networks had been unlocked by an external input that created a novel mapping between long-standing challenges and fresh perspectives. What had seemed like isolated, insurmountable problems became integrated into a coherent vision. And this is why the role of an enigmatic muse is not trivial. They operate at the level of metacognition, not instruction. They do not provide answers. They provoke the mind to answer its own questions with greater depth, clarity, and courage. This influence transcends skill acquisition or mentorship. It is a form of catalytic presence that shapes both thought patterns and emotional resilience. In some ways, it is analogous to the concept of entrainment in physics or biology. Two systems begin to oscillate in synchrony, amplifying each other's energy. Except here, the systems are human minds, and the energy is creative and aspirational. It is remarkable how this phenomenon scales. In one-on-one interactions, the effect is profound, but in the larger context, teams, organizations, even societies, the presence of individuals who embody this enigmatic influence can elevate collective thinking. Teams make decisions faster, pursue riskier but more impactful projects, and sustain innovation over long periods. The human brain is wired to mirror and amplify the emotional and cognitive signals of those it respects and admires. When the right individual catalyzes a group, it's not just motivation, it's a neurological alignment that enhances the problem-solving capacity of the entire network. And yet, for all this scientific clarity, the human experience of it remains deeply mysterious. You cannot measure inspiration with a voltmeter, nor can you fully quantify the gravitational pull of a mind that aligns with yours in this rare, profound way. You can track changes in neural activity, observe spikes in neurotransmitters, monitor fluctuations in heart rate variability, but the lived experience, the subtle recognition that your mind is being reshaped in real time, is ineffable. It is felt in the quiet confidence of knowing that what once seemed impossible is now within reach. It is felt in the excitement of waking up each morning to think bigger, risk more, and pursue visions that previously would have seemed unattainable. This is why the presence of a muse is often most potent when it is least obvious. It is not about grandeur or spectacle. It is about the quiet alignment of two cognitive and emotional systems, creating fertile ground for ideas that would not exist otherwise. And when this alignment occurs at the intersection of intellect, creativity, and emotional resonance, the resulting innovations can redefine what we understand about possibility. From interstellar travel to life-altering neural interfaces, from revolutionary energy solutions to transformative societal technologies, the fingerprints of such influence are everywhere, subtle yet undeniable. I have witnessed firsthand how such a connection can transform not just what is created, but how it is conceived. The very structure of thought evolves, constraints are reframed, assumptions are questioned with fresh curiosity, and previously unseen pathways for exploration emerge. The mind begins to operate with a kind of anticipatory intuition, recognizing solutions before the conscious reasoning fully articulates them. This is the neurological equivalent of a musician improvising flawlessly, with a partner who knows every note before it is played, a dance of anticipation, creativity, and trust that transcends linear logic. And here is perhaps the most profound lesson of all: the enigmatic muse does not diminish autonomy, it magnifies it. By catalyzing the brain's capacity to imagine, by stabilizing emotional circuits, by harmonizing cognitive networks, such a presence allows the individual to operate at the full extent of their potential. It is not control, nor is it guidance in the conventional sense. It is liberation. It is the removal of invisible barriers, the opening of cognitive and emotional pathways that make the impossible feel not only possible but inevitable. So, when we think about innovation, about creativity, about the human drive to push beyond limitations, it is worth remembering that the deepest forces often lie hidden in the most personal of spaces. Behind every remarkable leap, there is often a silent partnership between minds, an unseen influence, a presence that challenges, encourages, and reshapes without ever demanding recognition. And when this occurs, the world benefits not just from the output of the mind, but from the profound human connection that made it possible. In the end, the lesson is both simple and extraordinary. The people we allow into our inner cognitive and emotional worlds have the power to redefine not only our work, but our understanding of ourselves. To embrace such influences, to embrace possibility, to invite courage, to expand the limits of what we believe can be achieved. And in doing so, we honor the rare and enigmatic force that quietly, yet profoundly, shapes the greatest ideas humanity has ever known. And so, as we reflect on the extraordinary power of human connection, it becomes clear that innovation is never purely a solitary endeavor. The myths of the lone genius are seductive but misleading. They obscure the truth that our greatest achievements are shaped not only by our own intellect and effort, but by the subtle, often invisible influences of those who believe in us, challenge us, and see us as we wish to become. It is in this interplay between minds, hearts, and vision that the seeds of transformation are sown. Imagine the world not as it is, but as it could be, if each of us allowed ourselves to be quietly inspired by those whose presence sparks courage and creativity. Imagine the breakthroughs in science, the revolutions in technology, the solutions to problems that have long seemed insurmountable, all amplified because the human mind was operating in resonance with another, drawing from a well of understanding and trust that cannot be quantified, only experienced. This is the frontier of human potential, a place where intellect, emotion, and connection converge to create what was previously unimaginable. And let us not underestimate the ripple effect. One inspired mind influences another, and soon entire teams, organizations, and communities begin to operate at levels of possibility that once seemed unreachable. It is a biological, psychological, and social phenomenon simultaneously. The brain's natural capacity for empathy, collaboration, and shared problem solving is amplified. Neural pathways strengthen, cognitive flexibility increases, and emotional resilience becomes not just a personal asset, but a collective one. This is the mechanism through which visionary ideas scale, not because of coercion or command, but because of the invisible architecture of human influence. Even in moments of doubt, fatigue, or failure, the presence of such an enigmatic influence acts as a stabilizer. When the mind is exhausted, when the data seems impenetrable, when the equations refuse to balance, the awareness that someone believes in your capacity, someone whose perception of your potential aligns with the very best of your aspirations, becomes a source of endurance. The neural mechanisms at work here are subtle, but profound stress responses are dampened, attentional networks sharpen, and the brain remains in a state conducive to creative problem solving. Essentially, you are able to persevere longer, think clearer, and act with more daring than you could alone. This is why we celebrate the stories of innovation, the tales of technological triumph, and the accounts of genius, not merely for the outcomes themselves, but for the hidden human connections that underpin them. Every spacecraft that leaves the atmosphere, every transformative medical breakthrough, every revolutionary technology bears the imprint of not just the engineer or scientist who designed it, but of the unseen influences that shaped their mind, honed their focus, and expanded their courage. Without these quiet forces, the trajectory of human progress would be unimaginably narrower. And so, as we stand at the intersection of ambition, creativity, and human connection, we are reminded of a fundamental truth: greatness does not occur in isolation. It occurs in the spaces between minds, in the resonance of presence, in the quiet encouragement that nudges us toward our most audacious dreams. To recognize this is to recognize the profound responsibility we carry, not only to pursue our own visions, but to honor and nurture the connections that make those visions possible. Ultimately, the enigmatic muse, the silent catalyst, the presence that reshapes minds and hearts, is not just a companion to innovation, it is its lifeblood. And when we embrace the possibility of being influenced, of allowing another to expand the architecture of our own thinking, we step into a realm where creativity, courage, and compassion converge. It is here, in this convergence, that the future is born. So, as you leave this space, I ask you to consider the people who quietly inspire you, who challenge you to think beyond the obvious, who stabilize your courage and expand your imagination. Honor them, listen to them, and allow yourself to be reshaped in ways you cannot yet predict. Because it is through such influence that the impossible becomes inevitable, the unseen becomes tangible, and the extraordinary becomes the new norm. And that is the power of connection, the hidden engine behind our greatest ideas, our boldest ambitions, and our most profound human achievements.